Our gospel reading today comes from the Gospel of Mark. We have been with John for a few weeks, learning about how Jesus wanted him to be our bread. And so we are now returning back to Mark and the adventures that he is having with his disciples. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, put his fingers into his ears, he spat and touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," which means be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." This is the good news of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Gracious and loving God, may these words of my mouth and this meditation from my heart be filled with your Spirit, be filled with your truth, and may it be heard with open ears and open hearts and open minds, and bring us a message that we need to hear for our lives today, for our church today, for our world today, and for your eternal kingdom. Amen. Rebecca Schaefer is a speech pathologist and language pathologist who's worked for many years at the Leahy Clinic in Burlington, Massachusetts. And she tells a story about something that happened to her several years ago, late in the day when she was about to leave work. And this is what she says. "A weary 69-year-old man, looking older than his age, stopped me as I closed my office. He said effortfully, with a tight, twisted face, that he didn't have an appointment, but he wanted to ask a question. 'Sure,' I said, and brought him into my office. He awkwardly introduced himself as Mr. Henman. He already knew my name. Mr. Henman sat down on the edge of his seat, visibly tired from seeing many other specialists that day. At that moment, I had a strange sense that this was not going to be a typical patient visit. Mr. Henman told me about his many medical problems and his difficulty expressing himself to others. He hoped that in coming to a communication specialist, I would just listen. I was somewhat taken aback by that request. After all, wasn't that what I always did? I put down my briefcase and jacket, sat with my hand on my lap, and looked Mr. Henman in the eye. He spoke hesitantly, stuttering, looking away at first, and told me how the doctors put so much emphasis on his medical problems, but failed to ask him about his main concern, which was his speech. Because he found doctors intimidating, he sensed they were uncomfortable talking with him due to his stutter. He routinely answered with as few words as possible. It took so long to utter a sentence that his doctors often completed his sentences or interrupted him. Mr. Henman was convinced that his years of indigestion and sleeping problems were in part due to his anxiety about communicating. Mr. Henman had a 6th grade education, had never married, and had worked alone for 47 years as a metalsmith. He felt that now it was time to start living his life and learn how to interact with others despite his stutter. Interestingly, as I listened to his story, his speech gradually became less effortful, with only an occasional word or sound repetition. His facial contortions eased. He appeared relieved and shocked at the same time, as he had realized he had finally been able to express himself fully. Even though Mr. Henman spoke for only about 15 minutes, I felt as though I had been swept up in his life and in his remarkable transformation, even if it was only temporary. Now, as if by magic, I was back in my chair. Mr. Henman thanked me profusely for listening. He felt he would be able to sleep well for once because someone had taken the time to see his view of things. You can imagine how well I slept that night. Several days later, Mr. Henman's physician, a doctor from another facility, phoned me and reported that his patient's overall condition had improved considerably following his visit with me. The doctor asked what I had done after years of unsuccessful treatment by his staff. I told him I had done nothing but listen. For the first time, I heard someone blush over the phone. Listening, just listening. It's such a powerful activity. It can bring healing and transformation, perhaps unlike any other thing that we could do. In fact, it's true. Healing comes from listening. Tests have been done, and those who are able to share a stressful experience with someone who is willing to listen to them usually has lower blood pressure. Their blood pressure lowers when they get to share their stressful experience with someone who will listen to them. And because they experience confidence in finally being able to share their story, their immune system is bolstered. That's pretty great stuff that we can give to somebody when we choose to listen. Just listen. And there's a bonus gift. When we choose to do that, when we choose to listen to someone before we start passing judgment on them, before we jump in with our 2 cents, with our critique of what they're doing, or we start blowing them off because we have more important things to think about, or we are finding them to be not interesting to listen to, when we just sit there and listen to them, our health improves too. Studies say that people that tend to jump in right ahead when people are talking tend to have 7 times higher blood pressure than those who will listen. Just listen. So there's a great health tip for all of us. And not only that, but our immune system is bolstered as well. In fact, there's a symptom that's also known as, I can never remember what it's called, ego indulgence. And those people who tend to talk using me, mine, I, rather than you, yours, your, tend to live life with more dissatisfaction, tend to have poorer health, and tend to be prone to all sorts of vulnerability of stress. So some helpful hints that come to us from listening, just listening. On top of that, there's the creation of community that comes only when we decide to listen. Just listen. When we have a problem, and the best answer that comes when we have a problem doesn't come from the expert, doesn't come from the person that is given the position of authority. It comes from when the community comes together and everyone shares their idea, and we all give all ideas equal worth as we hear them, and are grateful for all the people who share them. Even though we may not at the end come to land on their idea, we value their contributions because the Bible teaches us that God almost always speaks from the least expected person and through the least expected message. So that's what we want to do when we come together, is listen to one another and have an adventure in learning what others have to say versus making sure our way of doing it is the one that's chosen. You never know what can happen when the least likely and it pops up and does something miraculous. There's the story of the pastor who was very preoccupied one Sunday because the church's building campaign was not doing as well as he'd hoped. And he was going to have to stand before the congregation and ask for a special extra giving to make the building campaign be successful. And he wasn't looking forward to that. On top of everything else, his organist was sick, and at the last minute there was a replacement. This isn't a true story. So angrily, the pastor thrust the bulletin to the substitute organist and says, "This is the order for the day, and you're going to have to come up with something after I have to stand before the congregation and ask them for more money." So the church goes, and at the end of the service, he stands before the people and he says, "I'm sorry, but we're $4,000 still in the hole. So I'm just going to ask for each one of you that can if you can give $100 to now stand." And instantly the organist played the Star Spangled Banner. The substitute organist became the full-time organist. That doesn't give us any ideas, but you just never know what's going to happen when you let go of your expectations of what's possible and let what's actually happening and what you're actually hearing come into play. In our scripture reading today, we hear a gospel story where there's a deaf and mute man that comes to Jesus. And Jesus spits on his finger and places it on the guy's tongue, which is an ancient medicinal practice. And he puts his fingers in the gentleman's ears and says "Ephphatha," which is an Aramaic term for "be opened." And instantly we're told this is what happens. He can speak. Can hear, everybody's astounded and goes out telling everybody, even though Jesus told them not to, that here's a man who can speak and hear, and we wonder, what was it about that good news that was so wonderful that Jesus didn't want anybody to know? Or maybe that Jesus wanted to wait till he died and rose again for people to know? Or maybe if they'd actually said the right thing, he would have wanted them to know. We just never know exactly why Jesus is telling people not to say things. But I'm guessing that probably when this man could hear, the immediate reaction was, "We are so grateful because this man can hear, and that means he can hear all sorts of beautiful things. He can hear his baby's first cry. He can hear someone who's close to him say, 'I love you.' He can hear beautiful music, not the John Cage stuff, that's for classical music fans. Anyway, not bad music, good music. Not the stuff they listen to today. But they're just grateful for all these great things that this man can now have. Now we know with these healing stories that Jesus' miracles are not just about physical things that God's Spirit can bring to us, which sometimes are true, but sometimes aren't. The more important thing is the spiritual healing, the hearing and healing that we get from Jesus. The inner hearing that Jesus can bring us. And is that good news that when Jesus opens our ears and we can finally hear that we're so grateful we can hear God's word, we can hear God speaking to us, giving us direction in our lives. That's such a wonderful thing. But is that the biggest gift that getting hearing that Jesus brings? I'm guessing that an even bigger gift that comes when Jesus opens our ears is not the ability to hear something, hear some product that's this good product, but it's to receive the blessing of the process of listening, the process of hearing what is happening in this moment, not what we expected to happen, not what we were afraid to happen, not what we were hoping to hear, not what we're not hearing, whatever it might be. We're hearing what's right here. And we're not judging it. We're not criticizing it, and we're not stepping on top of it. We're embracing it. Because God is always speaking to us in unusual places, unusual people, and in each and every moment, pretty much through each and every sound. Now, I know there are some sounds or some people that are dangerous to listen to. There are some people that have disorders that are also that we do not want to get caught up in their cycles. It's sometimes important for us to step away when we're hearing things that we sense are not good for us. And that's part of what Hearing Here now tells us, that we can step away and have the courage to do that. So that's an important thing to remember. And it's also important to remember that there are some people that don't have very good hearing, and they may feel left out of this message about being important to be present and hearing whoever comes into our midst without judgment. But there are other ways that we hear, that we show that we are attentive to those in our midst. We can hear with our eyes, we can hear with our hands, we can hear with the whole of our bodies, that we're very interested in whatever is being said by the person before us. So this is something we all can do. And it's something that is important for all of us to do. It's even something important enough for Jesus to do. And for that story to make it into all three of our synoptic gospels. The story of where Jesus encounters a woman and asks for her daughter to be healed. And, we think Jesus is always Mr. Nice Guy, always the one that's, of course, especially the outsider, especially a woman, especially someone touchable, of course Jesus would heal them. But what does Jesus say to this woman? It is not good I'm only here to feed bread to the children of Israel, to the children, and there's never enough and not give it to the dogs. It's a very weird statement that Jesus says, right? And we know that this woman is Syrophoenician. In some story versions, she's Canaanite. She's always some kind of a Gentile. And if we know something about the biblical world, Jesus was Jewish and Israelite, and Israelites were not to have anything to do with Gentiles. Not only were they not to touch Gentiles, but they weren't to listen to anything they said, because Gentiles spoke nothing but evil, because they weren't full of God, because only the people that were Israelites had God's Spirit. And so Jesus is really kind of responding in the way of his culture. He is not hearing this woman and her request. Not only that, not only is he telling her no, but he's calling her a dog, which is a horrible racial slur in the ancient world. And for many in the current world, it still is. And that's what he says. Now, what do you do with that weird statement? Well, some scholars will say, oh, Jesus is just testing her. He's just testing that woman to see if she's faithful enough to not give up. Some people say, oh, the word for dog that Jesus is using is actually little dog or doggy. It's really a word of affection. No, it's not. It's a very mean word. And it's a very mean thing that Jesus says. And if I were that woman begging for Jesus to come help me, and Jesus said what he did, I probably right off the cuff would either say something really mean back to him, spew some sort of racial slur back at him, yell at him, be very emotional and angry, or I would just run away crying because I'd been rejected. And if either of those experiences had happened, my stress level would only be ever elevated, and whatever was making Jesus really upset would remain really elevated. But that's not what happens. And I wonder if the woman who was saying this stepped back for a moment and heard, not only with her ears but with her heart, because she had a very open experience, heard with her heart and said, there must be something going on with Jesus that he would respond in this really cruel way. And we know from reading the Gospel of Mark, which we were doing before we went into John for a little while, that Jesus has had a bit of a trouble on the road, wanting to get away and pray and have some time to himself, because the people just are so crazy about him and wanting to come wherever they are and heal them of their diseases, and he just isn't getting enough sleep, and he's just not getting enough prayer time, and he can be kind of snappy. And he has been snappy. And once again, he's being really snappy. And what she says then, instead of yelling, is using a little bit of clever humor. She says, well, even though he's called her a dog, you know, even the dogs will love to lap up some crumbs under the table. A little bit of self-deprecating, charming humor, that's not unlike the kind of stuff that Abraham Lincoln was famous for. Once when he was at a debate and someone called him two-faced, he said, how could I be two-faced? If I had another face, I wouldn't have brought this one. But you know, when you say humor like that, it undercuts the tension, and it brings people together, and it helps us carry on as one. And that's what happens with Jesus. He hears that humor, and he is given a positive experience, a lifting experience, as is she. And I'm guessing with a twinkle in his eye, he says, go home, your daughter is healed. Thank you for waking me up and getting me back home. Thanks for listening to me and helping me become the person that I know, the healer that I know that I can be. If it's even important for Jesus, it's important for us all. So I have put in your bulletin a little insert that has a little exercise in it that I think you'll enjoy. And this comes from the book that Rebecca Shafir wrote called The Zen of Listening. And I don't know if I have a copy of that. Here it is. It's called Mindful Listening. And I'll just read this to you, and then you can take this home and do this, and it's very helpful. A few times over the next several days, try this listening exercise. Even if you are not a music lover, try to listen objectively. Find a concert on the radio and see if you can pick out the different voices, instruments, and harmonies. So this isn't listening for the quality of the music, this is listening to all the different harmonies and voices. And try isolating one particular voice or instrument for as many seconds as possible. Then return your attention to the blending of all the instruments and take in the whole piece. Now notice how each voice is necessary to carry this performance, but that each voice alone is just a fragment of the whole. Now, without analyzing or dissecting the musical performance, sit for a few moments and take in the music. Simply be witness to it. When we listen to music in this way, we are not thinking about the notes that come before the ones we are listening to now, nor are we anticipating the next passage. We are hearing here. We are not judging the piece, nor worrying about how long it is. We are just absorbing the music with our whole being as the music moves and changes. This is the interval of mental space that needs to be present when listening to another human being. To widen the gap of time between perceiving a message and interpreting its contents is the essence of mindful listening. Just being available and taking in the sounds and the voices and the person and the words that are before you. I would add a couple other important thoughts and suggestions as we commit ourselves to become better listeners in our world. Not only because Jesus tells us that that's what we should do, and Jesus does it, and that's what Jesus can do for us. And because it could not be a more important gift as Christians we can give to our world today that does very poor listening in just about every way. I don't know about you, but I have such trouble being an open listener anymore. I'm so constantly distracted by so many different things to have to negotiate and think about, whether it's healthcare or it's the new technology, or what to do with all the information that I'm getting from everywhere, because that's what the new technology can give me. And because we live in a culture right now where our national leaders of all sorts are thriving on creating chaos and controversy and finding someone to blame, which stirs up our stress and stirs up our anger, and it's very addicting. So the media, the 24/7 media, will keep on that, because then we'll watch the news that we want to hear and buy their soap that they're selling. It's very, very hard to be a good listener in our world. So we want to do that. We want to practice this, and we want to remember a couple other important things. One is that we know that God is always with us, that God is always here. That's a constant message of our Bible. And God is always coming in unusual ways, as I had spoken before. So we're always listening to whatever is around us, because that is God speaking to us. And so we want to hear what that message might be. It's kind of an adventure that every person before us is an opportunity to find God's message. The other thing is that, the next thing is that we know that Jesus is on the face of everyone that comes before us. So whoever is with us, we can see Jesus talking to us, especially if those are folks that are causing us stress, that are causing us to tune out, that are causing us to get angry. Let us see ourselves, not have to speak, but just see the face of Jesus on them and see what difference that makes in giving us peace and presence and that ability to be listening healers. The third thing, and this is super helpful, if it's not working, to trust that God is here or that you're seeing Jesus on the face of that person, see Jesus in your midst. Because Jesus, died and rose again and is with us always. And to imagine Jesus standing with you in your conversation with somebody, especially one that's a stressful conversation, it can be so helpful. Or to pray Jesus into the room before you have a difficult conversation and just experience Him, let Him be there with you. That will really help you become the Christ-like listener that we are called to be, that we are equipped to be, and that we really want to be for our world today. So let's just take a couple of moments before we move out into the world and try on this attitude of being active, committed listeners, committed to hearing what's here and acknowledging and embracing it. Let's just spend a few moments right now, once again, breathing in and breathing out. And doing that about 5 times, just hearing ourselves breathing in and breathing out. And then just let ourselves hear all the sounds that are around us. Not judging them, not naming them, just hearing those sounds. Maybe hearing them like someone for the first time who doesn't know what it comes from and just is curious about what that sound is sounding like. The big sounds, the little sounds. Know that all those sounds are telling you something about your walk today. And that your ears and your hearing are going to bring wonderful adventures, big and little. And that every sound is filled with God. Silently now I wait for thee, Spirit of God, illuminate.